we're very happy to be together today to discuss research and collaboration, because these are very, very important actions and processes that we practice in our everyday life to ensure that what we're doing and what we're offering humanity is the best quality ever. So the importance of conducting research on learning programs to develop better programming and to understand how impact is happening is something that can never be discussed enough. It requires building bridges between implementers and scientists. And that's why we're gonna share how research has supported doing better programming by offering different examples, and how to develop partnerships with academia and other way around, because collaboration is essential for achieving impact. And so this panel is going to be divided into two parts. The first part will be talking about research, why we do research, why is it relevant, what can we learn from it? And the second part is how to develop these collaborations and what are the challenges facing both doing research and collaboration. And one note that we would like to highlight in this discussion is that much, if not most, research is written in the global north for the consumption of organizations in the global north. And the language and format of writing is usually a barrier, not only to the layperson, but to people from the global south, because English is not their first language. And thus, this will lead to less feedback, less interaction, where the research is really needed and where it's actually focused on. And it dilutes the value of such knowledge generation, its capacity to build upon and improve at a local level. And we're going to challenge jargon and terminology, and maybe come up with a whole new framework or concept on how to conduct research that's useful and how to build these collaborations. I have a fantastic panel that we're going to go around and introduce one by one to share with us what do they do and how this relates to research or practice on the ground, because it takes two parts of that equation to succeed. I will start by introducing Emer Beamer from the Netherlands, who is the director of Designathon. Emer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rana, and thanks to everyone here today. So the work we do is with 8 to 12-year-old children. Our core question in our work with them is asking ourselves, how can we empower them to design a better world? We have a program which is a combination of design thinking and maker education, and all the challenges the children work on are the SDGs. And our aim is that they both get heard by society in their engagement and imaginative capacity to contribute, but also that they get to learn and grow creative thinking, collaboration skills, sense of agency. And I'm super excited about this panel because we have tried to validate our method, collaborate with researchers, find out, are they learning those things? And it's not straightforward. So I'm glad to learn and be part of this panel today.
Thank you very much. We're going to pick up on that when we start the discussion. Next, I'd like to introduce Asha Murphy from Adhiai from Australia.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Rana. Yeah, just a bit about me. As you said, I'm from Sydney, Australia. I'm actually a representative of all the camps in this discussion. I'm an educator and a social entrepreneur. And I've also got a master's degree in education psychology, where I focused on neuroeducation research. And I looked at the question of how can such research be utilized by teachers in the classroom? So, communicating the research to the teachers. Now, I have a varied background. So my initial degree was in psychology and genetics, and I worked in policymaking in the public service. And when my children were young, I just saw that, there was something wrong with the way maths and science was taught in primary schools. But instead of complaining about it, I took action. I went and qualified as a teacher and started my journey as an educator. And that has been very rewarding. But as a teacher, I saw the systemic problems, that the system was not addressing the issues of capable children who actually ended up falling through the cracks. So when I retired, I started my social entrepreneur journey, and I founded a company called Adhiai, which is to edify through education. And we believe that when children, especially girls, are given access to the best educational opportunities, it results in better outcomes, not just for them and their families, but the whole community. And we need to address the gaps of learning that were developed in the very early years too, because that's a very critical time. To make this possible, I created a multifaceted strategy, which we call Strailings. And the first component is an innovative game called Strailings Old Haven, which is a free mobile download. Then the skill powers acquired from the game are applied to real-world problem scenarios in our Strailings Explorer Club program, which is currently being developed. And then the third part is an outreach Strailings ecosystem platform, which is in the ideation phase. So we're very much looking forward to collaborating and co-evolving our innovation. And so the whole aspect of connecting with researchers and people on the ground is what we're about. And so that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Kavita Anand from India, who is the director of Adhiai. And you can correct me if I mispronounced, and welcome.
The organization is Adhiai. Adhiai means to study deeply to any text, such that the reader is transformed. So it's the deep reading of or a study which actually changes you, right? And that's what learning for me is all about. That sort of is the point. So we've been working in the space of leadership and governance because we've noticed that a lot of policy changes, but practice doesn't change. In fact, it's funny that research doesn't help it to change either. So it's quite interesting in that sense. So, the government comes out with policy, the rote learning remains the same. The next policy comes out, rote learning remains the same. So that's an issue. And so if you really want research to support the change in both policy and practice, you have to look at what kind of behavior change and mindset change does a policy require. And then you have to look at what is it that the leadership and governance needs to do differently so that practice changes. Because we all know that if a teacher begins to teach differently, children's learning experience changes. Similarly, if a policymaker or the administrator changes their behavior and their questions, the teaching changes, and that changes the learning experience of children. Now, this sort of ability for people to see the connectedness between a child's experience in the classroom and the leadership and governance space is very difficult, because somehow everybody thinks that teaching and learning is all about teachers. And so there's a lot of research on teachers, but very little research on how do you create an ecosystem that actually supports teachers. So Adhiai works to basically throw light on that space, a very dark space of how does change in behavior and mindset happen without a facilitated ecosystem. It can't happen. And so that's where all our work is. That's where the research, for us is interesting, and how we work with organizations, universities, colleges, etc., to work on that will be what we'll talk about later in this conversation. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. This is a very interesting comment and observation that we're going to really hash out in the conversation. Next, I'd like to introduce Alex Todd from Canada, who is the founder of Reliably Me.
Thanks, Rana. Delighted to be with you, everybody. So my name is Alex Todd. I'm a social entrepreneur and the founder and CEO of Reliably Me. We've developed a social contracting technology that applies a commitments nudging approach to help affect and track behavioral outcomes. And this is useful as a leading indicator for impact measurement. It helps students to develop soft skills, especially related to reliability and personal integrity, and empowers them with a portable personal credential. It's a character credential that they can use to ease their access to education, employment, housing, credit, insurance, and social groups. So I'm really excited to be part of the panel and to basically learn from you as educators and researchers to see what your needs are and to see how a technology platform like what we're offering could actually help in making the changes that we're all seeking to see happen.
No, perfect. And you actually touch on what Kavita was highlighting, behavior, mindset, and how do we change that? How do you understand that? Thank you. Next, I'll introduce Sharon. And Sharon is from Australia, and she has a number of things, but the most important, well, the one that was stood out to me was Wicked Lab. So let's hear from you.
Thank you, Rhoda. Thank you for the invite to participate in the panel. It's such a pleasure. There's so many people on the panel that I've got different parts of what I do in common with. So I do have a number of hats. I'm very fortunate to have a foot in academia and a foot in practice. So I'm the founder of Wicked Lab, the co-founder of Wicked Lab, which is a social enterprise that does have an education program, but also has software, and the focus is on bringing collaborations together to address complex wicked problems. And I'm also the founder of Community Capacity Builders, which uses systems thinking and to support social entrepreneurs to address complicated problems within complex problems. And both of these social enterprises have an education focus, but I've also got a number of research hats. So I've got for the University of South Australia, I've got an adjunct there as a research associate, and I'm also on the board of the UNIS Social Business Centre at the University of South Australia. I teach social entrepreneurship at the University of Adelaide, which is a postgraduate program, and I teach an undergraduate social enterprise course at the University of Adelaide as well. And I've got a visiting fellow position with the business school at Newcastle University in the UK, and I judged the Map the System program for the Scholl Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at the University of Oxford. But I realise it's not as easy as it is for me to have a foot in both camps. And so one of my current passions is I'm actually the chair of the South Australian Social Enterprise Council, which is a peak body for social enterprises in South Australia. And I'm very keen to set up a subcommittee for our universities to actually bring researchers and practitioners together so that it's easier for those connections. So that's me.
Excellent. We have a diversity of either practitioners or researchers or people who are in both worlds. And I think people who are in both worlds are very, well, they're not common. And so we're really happy to have this many here to really understand what's happening. Because if you're not in both worlds, you won't be able to understand them and therefore build bridges of communication. Sue, we'd like to introduce you. Sue is based in Hong Kong and a professor there. So please, Sue, introduce yourself. You're on mute.
Thank you, Rana. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Lovely. And I'm an assistant professor in Hong Kong University called Hang Seng University of Hong Kong. And my major area of research is in leadership and identity, but also do a lot of social impact measurement with NGOs and social enterprises. So I have 3 projects in hand, which are ongoing in relation to education. And one is looking at the social impact of university students who have disabilities, and they're graduates. So the whole program of education is about honing their work readiness. So it has business skills as well as internship, so that there are already 6 cohorts which have gone through in the last 3 years. So we're looking at a number of different aspects of these trainees. And so in terms of the work readiness, in terms of the leadership skills, and also their self-efficacy and all that. And another program is to look at like an alternative education program for low performers in secondary school students. And it's, I walked in at about the 8th year of the program. So the program has been going on through basically introducing young mentoring into secondary schools as kind of co-teachers, but at the same time, they identify low performers and using mentoring as an intervention. So that is a very interesting one that I'm going to, it's just the first year, I'm going to do it for 3 years. And once again, looking at the social impact of the whole program, from impact on the mentors, that means the young teachers, and also on the students, and also overall the school systems. And then the third one is on my students, because I teach leadership, social entrepreneurship. So we're looking at impacts of social entrepreneurship education. So other than being a researcher and a teacher, I also have founded an NGO that promotes all sorts of social entrepreneurship practices, from running social movements to promote ethical consumption. And also we provide social impact measurement workshops. And I've written a book on innovative social innovation education as well. So that's me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing the whole spectrum from scientist to practitioner as well. All right, so now that we know each other, I'm just going to start by introducing what I do as a prompt to ask all of you your opinion. So I myself I'm a professor, but I'm a professor of molecular biology, so really far away from all of this, maybe except in terms of understanding how our brain works and therefore translating behavior into chemistry. What are those chemicals that are buzzing around in our brain that make us behave in particular ways? And at the same time, I'm a social entrepreneur and founded a program called We Love Reading. Also back to your word, Kavita, about reading in depth, reading for understanding. In Arabic, in the Islamic tradition, the first word of the Quran is read. And read not just to literacy, but read to understand, read to benefit, read to reap the benefits of reading. And it's a program that has spread now to 61 countries. And what we do is we train youth and adults how to read aloud as an art, and how to hold read aloud sessions in their neighborhood. And the concept, back to Sue, is that these people and Sharon who are reading aloud discover their voices literally and figuratively, becoming leaders in their own right in their neighborhoods, creating change and becoming change makers. And that's why our motto is changing mindsets through reading to create change makers. And so being a scientist and a practitioner, I wanted to invite, not me, I'm the molecular biology, but other scientists in the fields of education psychology, leadership, and social entrepreneurship like you to come and study We Love Reading, to realize what is it it's doing right and how can we make it better. Which leads me to the question that I want to pose to our panelists is, how is research involved in the design, first of all, and evaluation of programs, and for what purpose, right? And that depends on who's designing and who's evaluating and who's asking and who's responding. And in doing so, what are the challenges and what can be done differently? Since we have this bird's eye view of seeing both worlds, how can things or research be done differently, and in what areas, to what purpose? And I'm going to start here with Emer to kick us off, because she's more of the practitioner, to discuss when we design programs, how is it done? I've seen examples where it starts with people sitting around a table at a university in New York, based on some theory, develop a program, and then go to some country in a developing country, quote unquote, for lack of a better word, and implements it, and then tries to evaluate, does it work or not, and so on. So I want to ask you, Emer, how did you design your program, and what do you see as a way, from your experience, that how programs should be designed?
Interesting, thank you. So how we design the program is a lot of paperwork first, and then, so I'm coming from a trade, my trade is designer. I create things, physical or processes, I design learning experiences. So I started with the belief that children are creative, care about the world, and I was searching for a process to help them enunciate that. But I had to find out what questions are they interested in, how much information do they need beforehand to tackle it, how much help do they need to apply their imaginative brains, what kind of tools can they use to communicate, draw, physically prototype their ideas. So I basically spent a year prototyping with children in the Netherlands, and then to validate the concept, ran it with partners in Brazil, Nairobi, Berlin, and Dublin. And our evaluation was actually how many different ideas are the children coming up with? How well are they able to make it and show it? And what's the self-evaluation from the child's perspective? What are they saying themselves that they get out of it? So that's how we developed the program. So totally not from an academic perspective. And then what we notice is that the academics are using language to explain what we're doing. So it's totally reverse engineering from an academic perspective. So then you see, 21st century skills, everyone should learn them, critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, agency. And we're like, oh my gosh, that's what our program is attempting to do, but we weren't using that language. So then we had a process of mapping our learning objectives to the learning objectives, for example, UNESCO's SDGs learning objectives, or OECD's Future of Education, where agency is a core component. And then we took a step back and said, okay, where do we find an academic who will help us assess if this is happening with the children? Very difficult, because it's psychology, and Asha, you just said you're psychology and educational sciences, but then we're working with 8 to 12-year-olds, so they don't have all the language to explain what's going on with them. And we're working in multiple contexts. But we found a group in India who are specialized in designing and evaluating empathy and change-making ability. So I don't know if you want me to go on too long explaining how we did that.
Maybe briefly, so we can bridge that to the next panelist. Briefly to talk about about the empathy and the change making.
Yeah, we designed a questionnaire. So on knowledge of topic, knowledge of the SDG, empathetic ability, and collaboration ability. And we did a pre and a post. And we adapted it to all those contexts with our local partners. And yeah, it was super, super interesting.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And actually, your description to me has raised a number of questions, which I'm going to throw out to the different panelists, and people can choose what would you like to comment or talk about. So one is, you're talking about program development, which I consider, I mean, our program, We Love Reading, was developed the same way, very organic, grassroots, bottom up. And because my take on, because we did it that way, and I'm sure you'll agree, we found out that it didn't just address certain particular goals, it actually had a holistic approach because it was developed very organically. So somebody can challenge that. Is that the right way, or there should be a combination, and so on? And what are the pros and cons? However, you also mentioned something else, that you did it with children in the Netherlands, and then you tested it in other places like Brazil and others. How much can we transfer something that's done? Because I'm sure children are children all over the world, but culture and experiences and expectations are different. And how much can I trust doing a testing in one place to scale it or replicate it in another place? So that's the second point, if anybody wants to comment on that as we go through. And lastly, you said you did a pre and a post with a group. I want to ask the scientists here, the professors, what qualifies as research? How is that? What you did, a monitoring and evaluation report, pre and post, or is this rigorous academic research? And where do randomized control trials come in? Or is that something we need to chuck out of the window because that's really clinical and doesn't apply with human beings? All right, so these are questions. Who would like to start to answer? I'm going to give the floor, and we're going to go around for everybody. Any volunteers to start? Or should I pick? Yes, please, Kavita.
one of the things that is different probably about the way we designed our program is that it was designed for scale. So it was already designed for transfer. And so what we had to do was we looked at what is possible for, looking at what good schooling is across the world, and sort of really looked at it across the world, not just in developing countries or developed countries, but really across to say what's common, and how do we use that to create a common language or a vocabulary. So in that sense, research did fundamentally inform what we did, because we did have to look across different kinds of indices, different ways in which people did inspection, as well as what was research done in that space. The other piece was that when we were actually getting our assessors or people who work with us to become part of the pool, like when we took on people, when we inducted them, we used a lot of research to train them up and say, this is what you need to look at and understand, because this is what scaled work means, right? Because we were working with 824 schools at one shot. So that kind of way of looking requires, I think, frameworks, requires you to have frameworks that are research-based. And that's where it's a bit different from doing something very organic, very small with one school or one set of children and then growing it bigger. And the mindset is very different when that happens. So just throwing that into the mix, saying that there are different ways of looking at how to set up a program.
All right. Thank you. I want to go to Sharon. Sharon, I'd like to hear your opinion. I'm playing devil's advocate here. Okay, so Kavita talks about research, looking and what I see. What does research mean, Sharon? Is it looking at literature, or research is? Please elaborate.
Yeah. Well, I guess for me, my approach and how I've got into developing the programs is through action research, and so therefore. I think the lived experience of being involved in an activity is really underpins what I've done. So for me, research is the peer-reviewed type of research, not to the extent of controlled trials, but to actually to be challenged with regards to your findings, especially when you're actually running the programs that are being evaluated. It's really important to have that peer review process. And so just a bit of background with regards to how I got on this, I guess, education program development pathway is I was working for government on urban regeneration programs in communities. One was as a economic development officer on an urban renewal, another was on a community development project, urban renewal, and citizen initiatives were emerging out of the work I was doing, and social enterprises were emerging out of this work. So I got called into a government meeting with state and local government, and they said, we'd like you to develop a learning program where what pops out the end is these citizens that build community capacity. And I looked at them in horror and said, it isn't kind of like this conveyor belt. You put these people on and this pops out at the end, you know what I mean? It was just like there was these conditions and this happened. But then I went away and thought, is there a process that could encourage that? And I ran another program close to another urban regeneration program and implemented this process, and this did happen. And so from then I got given a scholarship from a university as part of a master's program. So it was a business initiatives for graduates to do a master's. And as the 12-point research project, I developed the program. And then for my PhD research, I evaluated that program, which formed the development of these other couple of initiatives, the one that Community Capacity Builders runs with now, and underpins the software and education programs for Wicked Lab. So it's more of a journey, and the research and the practice are interwoven with my own learning journey and the learning journey I've been on with communities in South Australia. So for me, research is, and because I'm so intertwined, that need for a peer-reviewed process is really important. But it is very challenging for social entrepreneurs or educators that haven't got those connections with the academy. And in the entrepreneurship education space, or an entrepreneurship research space, we're starting to see this challenge of rigor and practice being addressed. So there's been a few workshops this year with regards to, I went to one recently on the practice of we, and how do we align the entrepreneurship process with the research process so that we're accounting for both, so that the researchers and the entrepreneurs can work closely together. And there's another one that I'm going to in the next couple of weeks, which is called the rapid response research, which is, you know, when you've got to rapidly respond to a crisis with communities and how you can do that. So I think there's a lot of work that education, that the education academia can actually do to actually look at new ways of working with education practitioners.
Thank you, Sharon. That's fascinating. You actually touched on 2 points that I want to highlight and ask probably Sue to respond. I think the whole research on social entrepreneurship is relatively new, because the whole, I think as human beings, we evolved to be problem solvers. That's how we survived. And today we call the way we create these solutions, we give them fancy names like human-centered design or social entrepreneurship, when they're innate in who we are. And so, but the actual, you know, let's say discipline is relatively new, and the research on it to try to understand it, to foster it, bring it back to life, so to speak, if it's innate, is relatively new. So I'm going to ask Sue to elaborate on that, since that's what she teaches, and to tell us more about the field, how it ties into research. Yeah, please, Sue. You're on mute.
Yes. Hi. I think what I want to do is to respond to you in terms of what are researchers and what do they do. I see very often when I'm involved in doing research with the NGOs, I am collaborators as part of the social change process, because most of the time, my motivation is not to go in to get data and get them published. I actually see that in terms of the social change process, you need to validate whether your intervention, if it's supposedly an intervention to bring about improvement of certain development of a certain kind of beneficiaries or communities. So 2 of my projects are involving that. So the projects actually stepped into helping different communities to be better players in the society. So in that case, what I actually do is to look at the logic model, i.e. What are the interventions involved, and what are the factors that are actually impacting from the primary causes to the process, and also what are the possible outcomes coming out from that to design the research model. So I would see that if we take research not so much as something of a lofty and high order thing, but see it as simply a kind of understanding of the theory of change, and to see whether the education process is kind of going on the right track as education implementers and practitioners are wanting it to go in the right direction. Research is simply a validation process for practitioners, and researchers, which I see myself as one, is basically helping the practitioners to be able to validate and also to make improvement. If it's off track, what is missing, and if it's on the right track, is there anything that you could do better and replicate it in such a way that you could actually generalize and develop more solid knowledge. So in the process of research, we develop the theory of change, what you have done right, and is it the major factors in bringing about change in the trainees, students, and consolidate it, and then present your theory as a new area of knowledge and spread it, generalize it, like what is being done by Kavita. So, so my role is simply make education program much more, I would say, kind of bring out the success, bring out the impact, and yeah, I think that we need to take away the kind of divide between practitioners and researchers. And as for, to answer your question as well, whether we will use the very scientific approach and the methodology and all that, I will also see whether we've got, what's the outcome for? Is it, would my client, I would call them client, although very often they are pro bono projects, whether they need to have the publication, do they need to go that far? And also how big is the sample size? If it's a smaller one, I will still help them. But if it's big enough, then I'll tell them that that is have research and publication value. How far do you want to go? So all these basically, I won't step out if I know that it's a good project and it's a worthwhile project, although the sample size is small. Because my role is basically to help them do the right measurement so that they could come up with evidence and to come and to talk to funders so that they could continue and ensure the sustainability of the good work. So that's how I see my role is there for supporting them and bring about success for their programs.
Oh, thank you very much, Sue. You actually brought up a very pivotal points. I'm going to elaborate on one and then give to Kavita because she wants to respond to you, and then we'll go to Alex and then Asha. But you talked about research is validation, and that's very important. And it raises the question: if it's validation, then probably a program should not be designed and then implemented. It should come from the grounds up, and then we invite the scientists to come in and evaluate what's right, what's wrong, how we can do it better. I'm going to stop there. Kavita, please share your comment.
Yeah, so I want to add to this, there's a tendency to sort of see the beneficiary or the client or whoever it is that we're talking about as somebody who's outside there. And I want to ask this question about, like, how do we involve the person who needs that change in looking at the change themselves? Like, how do we get the children to begin to look at the way things are changing, and how do we begin to get them to do research in whether it's working for them or not? And whether that's really taking people forward is more important, I think, than any kind of research looking at, outside in, because that has its own purpose. I agree that its purpose seems to be driven largely by funding that wants to then, make a point of whether we continue funding or not. But the actual research that needs to happen is this effective and is it working? And that should be done by not just the person who's working with the group of people who are being supported in making that change, but the people themselves. And I think they seem to be, that's going to be a very important thing to look at, is like, who is, whose data is it? Whose research is it? Who should be looking at whether movement forward has happened or not? Who should be identifying it? Yeah.
Yeah, you raise a very important question. Actually, is like, who's the driver, right? Is it somebody coming in to save somebody, or is it me, for example? We want to try to find a better word than client or beneficiary.
Exactly.
Because
exactly.
that propagates that victim attitude.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like, I want to solve.
I would say the actors, the people who are actually doing the change. Yeah.
Great. So this is one thing we'd like to come out of this panel, is getting a new glossary of terms and to promote that in the world, because language reflects on what's happening in our brain and our behavior. And so if we use the word beneficiary, we're stuck in that kind of mindset. But if we use actor, we're enabled and empowerment. And that actually leads me to Alex to talk about behavior and measuring that and how that reflects with language and terminology. So Alex, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rena. So I totally agree with the insights you guys are all sharing. It's fascinating. I think from my perspective, it's not an either or. I think speaking of language, we should be using the term and so so there is a valid case for bottom up and a valid case for top down. So think about it this way: you have a bottom up approach. Something's working, or you think it's working, and you want to be able to show that validate that it is actually working. It's not just your imagination and cognitive bias. And so you get somebody from the outside to do some research and validate that it's actually working. Now, the standard of proof doesn't have to be very high for certain commercial purposes. If it's, as long as it's working and your funders are happy to continue funding you because they have enough evidence that the program is working, then that's good enough. But if you want it to scale, then you want to be able to go to other places and show that this same approach is going to work elsewhere. And so to Emer's example, which I thought was excellent, is you tried in one place, then you tried to replicate in other places. And there you start to need a higher, because the standard of proof has to be higher. You have more at risk, more at stake, more money is involved, more resources, more people are affected. And you want more people to buy in. Your standard of proof has to be higher. So at that point, and you also need a common language. You need a common framework. You need common data. You need comparable data. You need to be able to also measure it over time and on a consistent basis, not just on at a point in time. So how do you translate that local into a scalable context? You need the academic rigor to do that. Just like Emma was saying. She had to put it in the context of UN SDGs or for UNESCO and the OECD education standards, whatever. So in a different language that is more common. So and so think about it. So you start off with one, and now you're going to apply it elsewhere. Well, who's applying it elsewhere? Well, you could have the practitioners, but you could also have the academics, the researchers, saying, okay, this is what we've learned here. Now let's plop it in somewhere else and apply it. So now it's going top down, but it's based on what was informed in other places. Now we're trying to figure out whether it's really generalizable, if you will. That's a term. So so I think, yeah, the answer is and. Now I guess I have a question for you guys as well, because it seems to me that data is a big issue. I mean, my sense is that that researchers lack timely, observational, comparable, predictive data on social impact, and how do you get that common data that's valid? And it seems to me that there probably aren't tools that will provide that common data. You can have, it's difficult to get observational data, because you don't have tools, and secondly, even if you had the tools, there's privacy concerns. And so it's difficult to obtain that data. And then in terms of relevance, the data that's typically collected locally is not necessarily relevant for researchers and for for policymakers and so on. So how do you incentivize the local organizations to provide the data that is actually relevant for a broader context? And then finally, how do you have it's fragmented. People are doing a spot research at a point in time, but how do you have a temporal way of, on a continuous basis, and monitoring the directional changes in outcomes and ultimately and correlate that to ultimate impact? So so for all that, you need some sort of common set of things that you want to measure that are universal, and while at the same time allowing for the regional differences in language and culture that Rana, you've talked about so much. So, but how do you do that? So one common element, I believe, and Rana, you brought it up, is behavior. in every case, whether we're trying to make a social change or an environmental change, whatever change we're trying to make, there's a change in behavior that starts at the individual level that's required. And so it's those changes in behavior. We can track the behavioral outcomes data for regardless of what the purpose is, what we're trying to teach or trying to learn. That is a common measure. And if we could get everybody tracking behavioral data over time, then we can see patterns, and we can also then infer what the impact is going to be. So, so that's my perspective. I hope that helps.
No, that's excellent. And actually, I mean, there's a lot of talk now, and I'm sure you can elaborate, or others can, about mining the data using artificial intelligence to understand behavior, and what are those universal human values that can be generalized, as you said, and learn from without. But the fear, as you highlighted, is falling into the trap of removing the diversity, which is so important. And I mean, it's okay if you remove the diversity. It's the fear is that you have bias, right? And then in one framework or one kind of thought kind of dominates, and everybody else is silenced. So that's a very important point. But I'm gonna go to Asha, because we haven't heard from her, to comment on our conversation, and then we'll go back around. Asha, please.
Thanks, Rana. Yeah, no, fascinating listening to all the different directions that everyone's coming from. My take is like what everyone says. It's all linking up. My point of view is from the point of view of the teacher, and then what next. So looking at in terms of data, we talk about data, but the researchers come in and say here's a set of behaviors, whatever, and for teachers they look at their individual circumstances, so their set of learners, so behavior modification, whatever, it's a dynamic, so it's that particular set of learners. And so is it reasonable to ask someone to come in and say, we've got this great new innovation, we've done it in class X and it produced such and such a really good outcomes, and we want you to use it now. So the teacher's kind of thinking, okay, that's great, that's a really good innovation, I'm always into looking at new things. Teachers tend to do things like that anyway. They're always experimenting and coming up with new ways to run the classroom. But is it going to work in my class? So what works in classroom A, will it work in classroom B? What works in one village, will it work in another village? So in a sense, in the data that the researchers collect, maybe in the what next, they look at not just something that worked or didn't work, but look at what is the underlying, the essence of what worked. You're a molecular biologist, Rana, and maybe it's at a molecular level, or a neurological level. Is that the common ground? And we say, yes, we did this in this class, but because of these particular factors, we know it can generalize to other things. So we get an essence. And so, so I had this idea that, instead of someone going in and saying, here's an idea, we say, this is a common thread that we've seen, and we take it to different areas and say, here's something, let's work together and let's weave this new material that will cover your set of circumstances. So it's not like you create one intervention. This is the thread of an intervention, but where you take it to Brazil, it looks one way. You take it to Kenya, it looks another way. You take it to different areas, and even within a country, different villages, it'll look different, because the practitioners, and so what Alex was saying, from the top down brings the thread, the essence, and the bottom up will weave the whole material to solve the issue. So it's a two-way street, as Alex was saying. And yeah, research comes in to find that deep dive. The researchers come in and deep dive into what is that essence that makes this intervention better than another intervention. So that's my kind of what next kind of thinking in terms of how research can make things both ways. You know, what Alex was saying about the two-way street.
Thank you very much, Asha. Actually, what I hear from you and from what I'm hearing from others, I'm taking a very bird's eye view from 30,000 feet, so to speak, is that maybe we're still stuck in a framework of how things have been done in the past. And maybe we need to try to get outside of the box and change the whole mindset framework of how we do business in terms of what are the good programs to achieve the goals that we're looking at. And what I hear from you, and I've seen in a few programs, is that rather than developing a program and scaling it, it's about enabling, empowering the people on the ground, wherever they are, to think for themselves, to produce a solution for themselves. So rather than I get a solution and scale, every person becomes a producer for their own local community, so to speak. And that's a whole different mindset. And it begs a whole different set of criteria, a whole different set of measurement, because measurement is different. It doesn't become I'm coming to measure you. It becomes I set what I want for myself and measure those and measure accordingly. So even changing how we measure. And that goes to the point, I think, of Kavita mentioned it, is then that everybody, then the data that is gathered by the people themselves, the actors, and then it goes up, boils up, and then suddenly whoever's on top, hopefully in a democracy, looks at the data and says, oh, all right, so this is generated by the people can see it, those who are the decision makers can see it, and then we have a much more real, let's say, a picture of what's happening, and therefore a much clearer path how to solve it or make it better. But this is system change, and this is something that has not happened. I think people have talked about it, but without intending, we get stuck back into the old framework because it's easier. We fall back into it, and I think maybe because of COVID-19, where everything has been falling apart, that we have an opportunity. That's a silver lining to come in with this whole new way of thinking. And try it out. And yeah, I'm a scientist. I'm always skeptical. This may be not the perfect way, but we have to try because the old one isn't working. Which kind of leads me to the next question. So I want you to keep thinking of that as an audience or as panelists and reflect on your own work. What mindset are you using? And how willing you are to go outside your comfort zone to test something new? Because that you really turning things upside down. And I think the most important thing that really would bother us is measurement, because we're used to measure success in a particular way. And changing this mindset is going to force us to change how we measure that success. And I think here funders, policymakers need to change how they do that and think of what the people really want. Is it just numbers? Is that enough? Or I want to hear stories, which always brings me back to behavior, right? Because stories are a reflection of our behavior and what's going on. And that's what matters when you talk about impact evaluation. You want to see what has changed really, not just a tally of a number, because that not necessarily reflects what's going on inside a person. All right, so this will take me to the next part of our discussion, which is talking about collaboration. I mean, these great ideas are coming because we're breaking those silos. It's not the scientists talking alone and the practitioners talking alone. It's people who, from both parts of the world, talking together, crossing disciplines, because that's where the magic happens. It's at those crossroads. So I'm going to start about collaboration with the kind of a story to stimulate a conversation where I was involved in a project where Yale University wanted to evaluate, so this is academia, wanting to evaluate a program, an intervention, practitioners that was being implemented by Mercy Corps in Jordan among Syrian refugees. Now the program was developed by Mercy Corps, so not by academics, but developed, well, I'm always suspicious of co-creation when it's an international NGO working with a very local culture, to me, the only way you co-create if the local people develop their own program. However, they call it that developed in correlation. And then I was invited to be part of that evaluation. And I was kind of, I didn't know where to put myself. So I'm the scientist academic. Yeah, we were doing biomarkers. Back to Alex, seeing the behavior, really, the chemistry in the brain for the intended goals of the program. But I struggled where to put myself. Was I the local academic? Or was I the international academic? Was I the local, because I'm from the people, so I'm also a receiver of that evaluation because I'm half Syrian, by the way. And probably some of my relatives were part of the program. So am I the receiver or am I the implementer? So it's very confusing. And so I'm going to throw this out to you because this is in the core of collaboration. Who collaborates with who, what's important, and how do we make sure that we face the challenges that comes out of it and not to fall into traps of bias and power dynamics. So who would like to start with this, to comment on it or ask more questions? Do you want to start? I'm going to go with Sharon.
Thank you, Rada. Collaboration is very important with the work we do at Wicked Lab and also community capacity builders, because we focus on building the capacity of collectives in a community, in a geographical place. So our education program and our software is actually used by what's called solution ecosystems. So if you think of a complex wicked problem in a place, you've got all of the different people, different initiatives that are addressing different parts of that wicked problem, and they're coming together as a collaboration. And they're undertaking our learning program, our complex systems leadership program, and they're using our software to map this ecosystem and map the transition of it. So as a researcher, where do we sit? We probably sit as a mentor. Like after the learning program, we're there to assist these the people, the collaborations that are using the software on an ongoing basis. We're there to assist them if they got any questions, but they own the data and they own the research. And so what we're starting to see, because our major clients are governments and also universities. So we've got a university in Western Australia, Edith Cowan University, that's been using our software for a number of years for a place-based food security project. And now they're publishing from the data of doing this community-based program. And we've currently got some participants on our current program from Berkeley University in the States. And so collaboration is really important for us, to the extent that now we're really investigating the readiness of collaborations to come together as an ecosystem and strengthen their ecosystem. So that positioning of where we fit, we want to be able to build the capacity of communities to take the work forward rather than making ourselves, we want to be indispensable.
My question to you, just to follow up, how do you ensure that there's no unconscious bias when you come in with your data, the software that collects the data, that's number one, and then just the whole framework that would put people in particular mindsets when they look at the data? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, for sure. There's kind of like, from a complexity science perspective, there's kind of like a transition. There's kind of like a well understood, I guess, pathway for transitions. And all the software does is look at the characteristics at different stages of that transition. And then the users of the software are just looking at the initiatives in the ecosystem to see what initiatives have those characteristics, so they can see how they're contributing to systems change. And so they're just keeping track on a real-time basis of the system dynamics in their ecosystem. So it's not so much something that's used as a rigorous analytical tool to say this is the state. It's more of like a SWOT analysis for the community to make decisions on where they're going to focus next to strengthen the cohesion of their ecosystem.
Great, thank you for explaining that a little bit more. That makes it much more applicable and removes that bias or the unconscious bias. Kavita, we'd like to hear from you. How have you been experiencing different types of collaboration, and where do you think are the challenges that you face in not just creating, but actually being involved in these collaborations? You're on mute.
This thing of the flipping is a real challenge. Okay, so I think the collaborations we've done are with both, I mean, we work with government very closely, so large systems for government. So we have to go with universities that are acceptable to government. That's a big challenge. The second piece is that when we believe strongly in agency, so we work, like I explained that, for us, it's about the voice of the actor, who's actually in that change process. And so getting sort of agreements, there's a whole lot of, when you're looking at research, there is a lot of protocol that has to be followed, and that itself is a challenge because you're working with people who may not give you permissions to use data, etc. And that's important, actually, and it's very, very important to understand that. And the piece that I think is the biggest piece is that when you, so traditionally, data has been picked up from schools and given and sort of sent up through a sort of a pipeline to a state that then publishes that data in a report, right? So that's the school doesn't even see data as being useful. They tend to see it as something that has to be passed on. So, and then when you kind of create a situation where data goes from the school to a mid-level officer level, they're not used to data coming from the ground up. They're used to orders coming from the top down. So their ability to respond to that data itself is always they're very confused about how are they supposed to respond, because they just play to the game that is given to them, right? There's a certain set of rules. And now suddenly you've got data coming from a bunch of people who are supposed to be given rules, not told, I'm not asked for data. So that whole business of saying, how do we want to use this data? And how does that become part of the research? In itself is sometimes a big question mark, because there's a tussle over who uses that data for what, so there are lots of challenges in doing research in this kind of a situation. But I think that it's in a way this is the fun of doing the research, because what's the point if it's all going to be very simple? I think that in itself, the action of doing research should become a developmental tool. It should lead to the greater understanding of the actors, of the facilitators and the administrators and everybody. So if that can happen, and that's where we are sort of, really, really finding it so interesting, because research is no, I mean, for me, it's never been an ivory tower thing. It doesn't make sense for it to be sitting in a university. Universities themselves don't part with information and data. If you want a research paper, you've got to pay for it. And sometimes we just don't have the budgets to do that. So if you want access to, who is creating the knowledge, for whom is it being created, who's using it? For me, there are big questions that are coming up, and let's see all of them as challenges that have to be overcome. And together, I think if we push for that, it should happen, because after all of the universities creating that data, that research, sell it for their own profit. So are they not profit-making organizations? And are they really therefore that unbiased, as we'd like to call it, because there's skin in the game for them as well. And the best part of it is, do they ever look at research on their own selves? I mean, does any department in the university say, yes, Kavita, come and do research on us to tell us whether we're being effective in our teaching or not? They'll never let me do that. So I find this all very, you know, there's hierarchies, there's patriarchy, there's all sorts of knowledge hierarchies. It's amazingly complex, but I mean, let's have fun figuring it out. That's all.
No, you raised wonderful, amazing questions. I love the last one about evaluating the researchers themselves, which should happen. It's a fair game. And I'm going to take this to Sue to comment, because she's coming from academia, and I think we need more and more people who are in both worlds so that they can solve these problems. But Sue, what are your comments? How can we go forward? Any advice for solutions in the future? Have you seen bits and pieces of this starting to happen?
I guess I picked up the last bit of Kavita's sharing. In that case, that kind of researchers or research machine is not really collaborating, because they step in with a transactional mindset. And I'm afraid I can't pick up that kind of mindset because that's my style. So I consider myself as a collaborator. So that's why I said most of the time, because the research is ongoing, but I make it very clear that most of the time they are pro bono basis. And so, and very often the projects are mainly for them to manifest their success as well as evidence their impact. And usually that's for getting more funding. And I want to respond to the kind of framework on collaborating as well as collecting data as such. So we talked about earlier on in the first part what sort of data and who to collect data from other than the players. First of all, in terms of the players, I think we've got psychologists here, so we're talking about self-reporting ratings, which actually has the bias involved, and it's nice to have Alex around, which I believe is an objective measurement. But at the same time, I'm also a coach of young entrepreneur in the process of incubation. And one of the young entrepreneur project is actually providing education for special needs learners. They are mentally mild but high functioning. And so basically, I would say, let's talk about the actors, data collection. From my point of view, obviously storytelling, that means also means discourse. We could actually then turn it in another form of data, but we could have supplementary data so that we put across the strengths as well as the different dimension of the players involved. We could have also, because that particular project, which is not has started yet, on the special needs students or learners or actors, whatever you want to call them, they are expressing their emotions and feelings and thoughts through painting. So what I see another opportunity, which is not very classic scientific or management research data collection, is actually how over time, the way they express through colors and also paintings would change if they actually, and because they have the art teachers around. And then I went through, usually I don't walk in and out to do research. I actually go through the whole intervention process. So I was there when they were having painting lessons, and then the teachers who actually took them through the painting sessions take us through an elaborate process of explaining how they use different mediums and different textures when they paint, actually expressing their feelings and emotions and complexity of thoughts. And I thought that's fascinating. And basically, so if they are using painting to express themselves, that is part of the data. So if photos and images could be a kind of data, the use of colors would be data as well. That's one dimension. And obviously we should have panel study. And so we take data at different points. Moreover, we should have multiple sources, i.e. from parents, from teachers, practitioners, for these people, for the actors, sometimes they might going into workplace. For these special need learners, actors, they actually are being trained to go out to sell their artworks. Amazingly, some of the artworks are actually commercialized into pillowcases, bed sheets, and duvet covers, because one of the fathers actually the premium good stuff. So they actually have stores in shopping arcade, and it's not the people, it's actually these players, actors selling them, standing at the store. So basically, there are all sorts of, the whole change process involved. Obviously, this is involving a social enterprise conducting this kind of intervention. So I want to say, if we look at each project is different. We just have to look at the opportunities in how to do research. And yeah, that's the way I see it.
No, thank you for giving those examples, because that also raises this new framework of not looking at individual indicators, but looking holistically, and not looking at, a certain behavior. Everything has to be taken in an organic, more natural way, not a black and white, but a more fluid, and studying nature in the raw. This is reality. This is nature. And I think only in the last 200 years of modernity that we've put things in boxes and silos in the effort to understand better, but we're now hitting a wall that if we don't connect them again, we're not going to be able to understand them properly. Maybe that helped in the beginning, but now it's actually a barrier. But this leads me, I'm coming to you, Emer, is how do we make sure, as we, whether it's in the way we're doing things or the new way that we want to go, as we interpret our understanding of the data as it is, or in the new ways of interpreting data, whether through art and others, that we, who is interpreting the data, right? Because if you're coming, say, I'm a scientist from, let's say, the UK, and I'm coming to study children in Uganda, looking at the data, okay, even if everything is co-created and everything is done on the ground, but then I'm coming in to understand what's happening and analyze it and produce an expert report that will be used and generalized for policymakers and practitioners. How truly can I understand what's happening? And how do I remove that unconscious bias with all my good intention? I don't want to raise that, but I'm going to Emer. Oh, yes, please, Sue, and then back, Emer, it's your turn.
In qualitative grounded theory approaches, so if you have a research team, the multi-perspective of researchers making inferences, it's wonderful. That's it.
Yeah, but absolutely, I agree with you, but we need to, so this is a question that I was going to take to Asha later, but I'm going to go to Emer just to follow that thread, is that how do we ensure that we have those multi-perspectives, that we're really involving the local, for the people, and even when we bring them to the table, how do we make sure that there are no barriers, whether it's power dynamics, unconscious bias, intimidation, unconscious, or even language barriers? The onus is on who to translate to who. And we know these exist, but let's go to Emer, and then I'm going to go to Asha. Please, Emer.
Thanks. So I appreciate your concern for the biases, and especially the hierarchical ones, whether they're intercultural or within the same culture. They're very prevalent and definitely very much direct both the data collection and the interpretation. I wanted to make 2 points. One, I wanted to go back to the way we designed the program, because it sounded like, yeah, I often have this problem as a practitioner, that I'm actually doing really scientifically detailed methodological work, but because I'm not using the language that academics use, they think I'm just like, hoo-hoo, let's see what happens. But it's like seriously well thought through every step of the way and revised and adapted. So I don't know then if I'm doing participatory action research or I'm a designer, but anyway, it's a pet peeve, obviously, of mine. When we designed the program, I had worked in 22 countries with young people co-creating, and was very much designing for a universal program and incorporated a lot of that. Okay, so that's the first point. I wanted to defend my intercultural sensibility in the approach. And then the other point I would love to find the answer to, and it doesn't happen to be today, but it reflects to what Susanna was saying about looking at the paintings and the colors. With the work we do, the only people I've seen being able to do the kind of research that we would need to find out what's going on with the child are the ethnographic style folk. But what the funders want from me are the remote control, the control group, and over a longer period of time.
Randomized control trial.
That one, and they want big numbers and they want significant outcomes. And these things just do not intersect, as far as I can see. And to me, it's a conundrum I've seen for 20 years, and Kavita's laughing, because when I work with the RCT folk, they are very bad designers. I'm sorry to say, they don't understand who they're working with. They don't understand the context. They think they've got a whole year for people to just sit down and ask their questions. They work in their own language, the whole thing. And I'm looking at their work and I'm thinking, are you for real? So yeah. How do we mix the ethnographic with the more traditional to come to decent, holistic outcomes that are considered valid?
Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think every program that is developed bottom up with a holistic approach struggles with that, it hits that barrier, which is measurement, because it doesn't work. It has to be storytelling, ethnography, interviews and stories, as Sue mentioned, to really capture what's happening, rather than just the questionnaires and the numbers. And I remember being a very hardcore biologist coming in and looking at surveys where somebody fills in a box, how do I feel today? It's like, how do you trust that? And not that the children are not saying the truth, but how can it really reflect what's happening on the long run? So I think this is a call, and I hope that from our discussion today, we'll come out with a paper, a white paper, an opinion paper. And I think the more we talk about it, the more people will heed it. And every great idea, every, let's say, development always started with people looking at you and saying, not believing and thinking what you're talking, it doesn't make sense. But it's sticking to that gut feeling and the real experience on the ground that we know, we really know. When a report comes back of great success because they have numbers, when we know on the ground, really nothing has changed. It's the deeper changes that are long-term and stay. Which brings me to Asha. Your comments and thoughts on this conversation about collaboration, about what is local and international, jargon.
Yeah, thanks, Rana. It was very interesting listening to all of that, and I can so identify with what Emma said. And I suddenly had this thought of the funders sort of almost having like a GDP, what is it, gross national product sort of thing, of their data or what they measure on, whereas what it's really needed is something like a happiness index. So maybe in terms of what new measurement we come up with, it is not so much about the data in the sense of what improvement was done and by this much or whatever, but in terms of what you were saying about how do people feel, so that ticking the box and say I feel great, measure that, how do you measure that, whatever, make something in that sense. For going back to the collaboration idea, collaborating is actually very difficult. In the sense that, a lot of people think, okay, collaboration is consultation, which is not. Some people think collaboration is cooperation. So, you know, we cooperate with each other and we're collaborating, which it's not. Collaborating is actually coming together and actually, like I said, you know, a bit before I'm talking about the material thing, you're actually weaving something together. So you've got a germ of an idea and you weave it together to create something. So that whole co-creation bit, and not just co-creation, you collaborate and you co-evolve the idea. So you got the seed and it evolves. You grow it up into a tree, but the tree growing in one village might be a different tree in another village. So from that seed, you can grow all sorts of things. So, and that's what collaboration does. It doesn't produce the same thing. It produces different things in different areas. So, and something else, there's a quote, I actually wrote it down, so I'll go and try and search for it. And it's actually somebody, it's actually H.E. Lucock, I think his name. He talked about, he said, you can't whistle a symphony. It takes a whole orchestra to play it. You may have heard this before. And so, you know, my thought was, you have an idea for an innovative intervention or something, but that may only be the string section. So what you want is, you want to get all the other instruments to come in, and you get all those players, whether the designers, the developers, the researchers, the people on the ground. You know, who's the expert? You know, is the expert the local researcher, the local academic, or is the expert the person who's actually in the village and knows every single person there, and knows every child, and knows this child does this and that one does that, and you know the whole dynamic? Is that the expert? So who's the expert? You know, these are the things. You get all these instruments come together, and then you have the glorious symphony. And each orchestra can play a different, like you're playing the same symphony mainly, like the same notes, but you come out differently. So that's to me is collaboration. So that's kind of like my thought on you know, how I see it, and how, and why not, you know, ask the question, why not? So yeah.
Great. Well, I'm going to end this part so that we move on to the conclusions with Alex, because he hasn't commented on this, is how do we harness technology to achieve this goal of collaboration as an orchestra, as Asha said, without being stuck where technology is controlling us and fall into that trap?
A great question. Yeah, so just kind of to dovetail onto the collaboration question, you know, what does it take to collaborate? It's a trust issue, but trust is really hard. And why do you need trust to collaborate? Is because you're relying on the other parties you're really putting resources in place. You're staking your resources and depending on others to come through, and in a way that is consistent with what you're trying to accomplish. It's a risk. You're taking a risk, and if you don't trust the other parties, the parties don't trust each other. They're on the same page, the same set of values, the same standards that they're meeting, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to fall through. And so how do you do that? How do you establish, what is the foundation for that trust? I mean, it's difficult to build and then to collaborate and find parties and all that's difficult in itself. But what's the foundation for that? So in my mind, the foundation is it starts, well, ultimately starts with culture, starts everything. But in terms of a mechanism, I would say it's transparency through a common data pool of some sort, common shared information, and a governance structure where all parties are part of that governance structure that sets the rules of engagement, if you will, and how the data will be used and so on. So once you have the parties that feel that they are empowered with the information equally and have equal control over the engagement process, then I think that's a good starting point. Still might break down, but it's still, but I think it's a foundational starting point. So from our standpoint as a technology provider, what we're using blockchain technologies specifically to facilitate collaboration across the ecosystem. And the reason blockchain can help to do that is because it creates it's a network of participants with a common governance structure where everybody agrees on what goes into this kind of distributed database and how it can be accessed. And so it's all very controlled. And so everybody's working off the same page, if you will. So that's a starting point. And then you have parties that participate in that. And so the other part about collaboration and ecosystem inclusion and system change is that there has to be something in it for everybody. So think about it this way. You have, we can start at any point, but let's start from the top, where it's follow the money. And so you have funders, policymakers and funders who want to make changes and who want to influence those changes with their resources they can provide. They need to know where to put that money and how are those resources and how effective they're going to be. Then there's the organizations who are receiving the money and then distributing, the intermediaries, and distributing it to the different educational programs and social programs. They need to be able to get more money. So they need to be able to show that the programs are working, and this is why they are allocating one way or another. Then the parties that are running the programs, they're competing for those resources from the intermediaries to try to get those and demonstrate that their program is more effective and more valuable. Then you have the individuals who are, we call them beneficiaries, but let's call them actors, who are supposed to benefit from it, and they're being compliant in terms of what the program is asking them to do. But what's really in it for them? Is there some intrinsic, both extrinsic and intrinsic motivators that they have to do this? What do they get out of it by participating in a way? Is their whole heart in it? Are they coming out with? Are they being empowered in the process, or just being directed to participate in the program? And then finally, so then we have people who are, you get educated, but then what? What happens as a result of that? How do we close the loop? Well, the whole purpose of being educated is to be able to empower you to prosper, or for improve your well-being or health or whatever as a result. So who cares about what you've accomplished through your educational program and where you're at? So that means, those other organizations are going to evaluate you as an individual who's come out of the program. How effective have you been? How committed are you? How, what are you going to do to contribute to that organization? How are you going to be successful in contributing to the objectives of the organization to which you want to which you're applying? So think about it this way. It's an entire ecosystem. And so what we're trying to do is we're starting off by saying, hey, let's give people an opportunity to build a personal character credential based on objective evidence of their behavior. They carry that credential and they build it up by earning badges. They make commitments, they make promises through different programs that they're just all concurrently. It doesn't matter. It's not just one organization that they're earning from. It's from every aspect of their lives. They're building up these badges, or making promises, keeping the promises, building up badges, building up a reliability record, a punctuality score, confidence score. It becomes a portfolio that represents their authentic self and social worth, their reliability, their personal integrity, essentially their good character. That's what they're getting by as a common set of data that they can then use to empower them when they're seeking opportunities in life. Then what are the benefits to the program people? The people who are running the program can get data as a result of that in real time to intervene when somebody's confidence is going down, when they're not able to meet commitments and so on, and help them as an early intervention. And then what does that also helps them to provide objective evidence of the program's effectiveness when they're seeking funding. And then the funders, then policymakers, can direct their support appropriately to where they feel that the programs are going to be most effective. So it's a system. It's a holistic system approach where everybody has to participate. It's all based on a common data set that everybody shares, and the people who are putting in the data, relying on the data, are in a governance position where they can control how this data is being collected and how it's being used. And at the same time, the program people are are defining what those badges are, what the processes are, what the standards are to meet them, what they mean, what they stand for. They're, are we collecting data based on language? Are we how people are responding in a particular language, or are we using visual images? Are we, is it micro surveys? How are we? That's all defined by the program delivers, but the common element is the behavioral data that comes out of it.
No, what you described, I mean, especially the first part, is actually how the system is, and that's what we're trying to challenge. And you're saying that maybe we can challenge it by in the way that you described from the bottom up, but I still think that we need to break open that system as well, because still it's all dependent on somebody driving it from the top, and that the bottom have to prove themselves to the top. And I think that by itself is a problem. And it's more about, people should decide what they want, regardless of the people on the top. But that's a maybe more societal, philosophical kind of conversation. We're actually at the end of the time, and I'm just going to give 30 seconds for each panelist to give us one recommendation for anybody who's hearing us to go home and do something to make a difference, so that the future generations will have a better chance of achieving the goals of humanity. And I'll start with Sue, and then we'll go around. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. We should all consider that in education, we are unleashing people's potential, and every actors, learners, players, we consider them as leaders, no matter what age, no matter their disabilities, abilities. And when we could actually then unleash and develop their potential in such a way that people can see them as all kinds of leaders and all kinds of positive agents, this is the way to go forward.
Thank you. Emer.
I concur. Take people seriously.
Asha.
Yeah, I actually have a poem by Robert Frost that I've lived by since high school, and it's The Road Not Taken. And he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So what I suggest is that, especially for social entrepreneurs, to find that grassy path instead of the well-trodden one. And don't go down it by yourself, but grab a whole lot of other people, grassroots people, researchers, whatever, data analysts, everybody, grab them along and walk it together. You never know where your journey will take you, but you learn a lot from each other on the way. So that's my takeaway for that.
Alex.
Yeah, I think just start measuring, incentivize people to change behavior and track how they're changing behavior. Everybody does that in their own way for their own purposes, and but behavior change is universal. So start doing that.
Great. Sharon?
For me, create the space for researchers and practitioners to come together to understand each other's work and to find ways where you can work together that are mutually beneficial and you can learn from each other. And I'm thrilled that Catalyst 2030 is starting a new working group from theory to practice. So I'm looking very forward to being involved in that working group. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Kavita.
Love, trust, and respect are starting points, not nothing to be proved. They are the starting points of the journey. The journey has to be enjoyed. Let's have some fun in life. That's it.
That's amazing. This is wonderful advice. And I'm going to end with saying, nothing's impossible. Whatever we see today, there's always hope. And so long as we're all trying and working together, I'm really happy that we're all part of Catalyst 2030, enabling change together, and everybody counts. So thank you very much. And we're going to, write a paper together, get this out to the world, and start the seeds of change. Have a great day, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Rana.
Thank you, everyone.
So much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.